The sound of the train wheels hummed beneath her seat as Julia held tightly to her travel bag. She was nervous, but also full of hope. Her large frame barely fit into the narrow train seat, but her spirit was soaring. California. She was finally going to California. After one whole year of writing letters, saving money, and waiting for immigration papers to come through, the day had arrived. Julia was going to meet her fiancé, John, a man she had never met, but who had written her every month since they were introduced by his Aunt Anna. Julia looked out the train window, imagining what John would look like in person. She had only seen his photos. Handsome, tall, with thick black hair and kind eyes. He had seen hers too, but only her headshot. Julia never felt the need to send a full-body photo. Why would she? She had a beautiful face, radiant smile, and eyes that twinkled with kindness. People always said so. "I hope he likes me," she whispered to herself, her hands gently stroking her soft dress. "I hope I make a good impression." The plane ride had been long, her body sore from the tight seat, but none of that mattered. Her heart was full of love and dreams. She imagined John wrapping his arms around her at the airport, telling her how happy he was to finally see her in person. She smiled at the thought and held it close like a treasure. At the airport, she stepped off the plane, scanning the crowd. Then she saw him, John. He was standing tall, holding a bouquet of white roses. He looked just like his photo. Her heart leapt. She smiled wide and waved excitedly as she hurried toward him. But then, something changed. John's smile faded the moment he saw her. He lowered the flowers, his eyebrows raised, his lips forming a tight, uncomfortable line. Julia's steps slowed. Her heart dropped. She noticed how his eyes widened in shock. He wasn't smiling. He looked disappointed. "What's wrong?" Julia asked softly as she stood before him, her voice trembling. John looked away, adjusting his collar. "You didn't send me a picture that showed your whole body," he replied coldly. The words pierced Julia like a knife. She froze. She looked down at her body. She knew she was overweight, very overweight. But no one had ever made her feel ashamed like this. Not like this, not with those cold, rejecting eyes. John fished into his pocket and pulled out a few bills. "Here," he said, handing them to her stiffly. "You'll need this to take care of yourself." Julia held the money in her hand, confused, humiliated. "John, I thought—" "I have to go," John said, cutting her off. "Take care, Julia." And just like that, he walked away, leaving her standing alone in the airport terminal. The world around her grew silent. Julia stood there for what felt like hours. Her hands trembled, her eyes blurred with tears. She sat outside a nearby coffee shop with her bags beside her, crying softly into her handkerchief. She didn't know anyone in this country. She didn't know where to go. Hours passed. Still, no sign of John. No call, no letter, no second thought. At last, she stood, picked up her luggage, and walked to the nearest train station. She boarded a random train and got off at a bustling station where many people were disembarking. She found an empty bench, sat down, and cried quietly until exhaustion overtook her. She fell asleep. When she awoke, the sky was turning orange with the setting sun, and a gentle voice broke her daze. "Miss, are you okay?" She turned and saw a middle-aged man in a brown hat and coat, sitting beside her, watching her with concern. I don't know where to go," Julia whispered, her voice cracked with sadness. The man's eyes softened. What happened? Julia hesitated, but the words came pouring out. Every painful detail, the letters, the engagement, the airport, the rejection, the shame. The man listened quietly, his expression never changing. No pity, just kindness. "My name is William," he finally said. "You don't have to stay out here like this. Come on, let's find you a place to rest." Julia looked at him suspiciously. "Why would you help me?" "Because sometimes life puts people in our path for a reason," he said. "And you look like someone who needs a friend." Julia hesitated again, but then nodded slowly. William helped her to her feet, took one of her bags, and led her toward the street. He didn't take her to a hotel, but to a modest guest house where he paid for a small room in advance. He made sure she had food. He gave her privacy. He checked on her the next morning with a warm cup of tea. For days, Julia stayed there, heartbroken. She didn't eat much, she barely spoke, but William didn't leave her alone. He brought her novels and newspapers. He talked about history, literature, and places he'd traveled. He never once commented on her size. Instead, he spoke to her like she was important, valuable, seen. One day, as they sat outside the guest house watching the sun set behind the buildings, William said, "I have some news." Julia turned to him, eyes still puffy from the tears she'd cried that morning. "I sent someone to find John," he said. "He's been located." Julia's heart raced. "And?" William sighed. "He told them he doesn't want to be contacted again. He said he called off the engagement." Julia bit her lip, trying not to cry. "So that's it? He just erased me? I'm sorry." Julia nodded slowly, blinking back the sting in her eyes. William reached out and gently placed his hand over hers. "You're going to be okay. You just don't know it yet." That night, Julia cried harder than ever before. But she wasn't alone anymore, and that made a difference. A week later, William knocked on her door with a wide smile. "I found you a job." Julia blinked. "What?" "A bookstore, not far from here. They need someone who loves to read, someone with a gentle heart and attention to detail." Julia's heart jumped for the first time in weeks. "Me? You?" She stood, ran to him, and wrapped him in the biggest hug she could manage. "Thank you. Thank you so much." William smiled. "You're welcome." Julia started working at the bookstore the following Monday. She was nervous at first, but her love for books kept her steady. She cleaned the shelves, memorized the layout, recommended good novels to customers, and took notes in a small journal during lunch breaks. Soon, the customers began asking for her by name. The owner noticed. Within months, she was promoted. By the end of the year, Julia was running the store. William visited often, bringing her coffee, helping with deliveries, and talking late into the evening. And slowly, something grew between them. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't forced, it was real. One evening, as they walked by the lake near Julia's apartment, William stopped and looked at her. "I don't know if you feel the same," he said gently, "but I think about you all the time." Julia's heart skipped. "I never imagined falling for someone so quickly, especially after everything you've been through," he continued. "But here we are." Julia smiled softly. "I feel the same." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Will you marry me?" Julia gasped. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Yes, yes, I will." They kissed under the streetlight. Two hearts that had healed in the most unexpected way. The weeks after the proposal felt like a dream. Julia walked around with a smile that could light up a city block. Her cheeks glowed and her eyes sparkled with new confidence. William treated her like royalty, not because of her looks, but because he genuinely adored her soul. Still, despite her joy, Julia often looked at herself in the mirror and whispered, "Do I deserve this?" The trauma of John's rejection haunted her. The way he had looked at her, as if she was an embarrassment, had left a scar she couldn't shake. But William saw her pain, and he never pushed. "Let's do this at your pace," he would often say. "You don't have to change anything for me." But something in Julia had already begun to shift. Not for William, for herself. She started taking long walks every morning. She bought healthier groceries. She joined a small yoga class in the neighborhood. Day by day, pound by pound, she began to transform. Her co-workers noticed. "Julia, you look incredible," one of the customers gushed. But Julia only smiled politely. Her weight was never the real issue. It was the shame attached to it. That shame she was beginning to let go of. Months passed. Julia walked down the aisle in a breathtaking champagne gown, her waist elegantly trimmed, her cheeks softly contoured, her hair curled into romantic waves. She looked like a queen. The wedding was held in a sunlit vineyard. Rows of white chairs, golden arches of flowers, jazz music in the background. But it wasn't the luxury that made it magical. It was the way William looked at her, like she was the only woman in the world. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant declared. As they kissed, Julia whispered, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." William smiled. "You saved me too." What Julia didn't know was that William had secrets of his own. The next morning, as they sat in the garden of their honeymoon suite, sipping tea, William cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to tell you something." Julia raised her brow. "I'm not just a bookstore owner," he said, setting his cup down. "I own a chain of hotels across the West Coast. The bookstore was my mother's. I kept it because it reminded me of simpler times." Julia's mouth dropped open. "You're rich?" William nodded, smiling nervously. "I didn't want you to love me because of that. I wanted to make sure you saw me." Julia burst into laughter, tears falling down her cheeks. "You ridiculous man! I loved you when you brought me tea and carried my luggage off a bench." They laughed together. Their life took a dramatic turn after the wedding. Julia was made vice president of William's company. She learned the business, signed documents, traveled for meetings, and bloomed like a flower in full sunlight. But with success came whispers, gossip, envy. One day, as she was preparing for a major hotel conference, her secretary knocked. "Ma'am, someone just submitted a resume for the managerial position you advertised." Julia barely looked up. "Put it on my desk. You should see for yourself." Julia took the paper. Her heart stopped. The name, the face. John, her ex-fiancé. The man who abandoned her at the airport and broke her spirit. The resume had a small note attached. "I didn't know how to reach you. I need this job. I am sorry." Julia sat back, her pulse racing. Her past had come full circle. Dear amazing viewers, do you think Julia will let John back into her life after how he abandoned her at the airport? Please keep watching to find out. Before I continue, I would like to ask you to kindly subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed yet. Please click on the subscribe button. Much appreciation. And if you are a returning subscriber, welcome back and thank you so much. Now, back to the story. That afternoon, Julia told William everything. His jaw clenched. He wants a job now? After what he did to you? I don't know what to do, Julia whispered. Say no. But something inside Julia stirred. Curiosity, closure. She scheduled the interview. The next day, John walked into her office, wearing a cheap suit, holding his resume like it was his last hope. When his eyes met hers, he gasped. Julia! She sat still, composed, flawless in her red silk dress. I see you found your way here, she said coolly. I didn't know you were… look at you, John stammered. Julia didn't blink. You left me at the airport. You gave me a handful of bills and walked away like I was nothing. John dropped his head. I was young, foolish. I made a mistake. You made a choice, she corrected him. You didn't even try to know me. I've paid for that choice every day since. Silence. Then she spoke again. I'm not the woman you left. I'm stronger, smarter, and I've found someone who never made me feel ashamed of who I am. John nodded. I'm not here to dig up the past. I'm just looking for work. I've lost everything. My job, my home. I've learned my lesson the hard way. Julia studied him. He was thinner now, a little hunched, worn out. Time had humbled him. She leaned back, her voice cold and professional. I'll think about it. He nodded, swallowed hard, and left the office. That evening, William came home to find Julia staring out the balcony. Why are you thinking so hard? He asked. I don't know if I should help him. Would it bring you peace? I think so. Then do it, but on your terms. 3 days later, John received a call. You've been hired, Julia said. Report to the Garden Hotel downtown. Entry level, no special favors. John paused. Thank you. But hear this clearly, she added. If I ever feel like your presence disrespects the peace I've built, you'll be gone. Yes, ma'am, John whispered. Over the months, John worked hard. He kept his head down. He never asked for anything extra. And sometimes, he'd stop by Julia's office and leave small notes. I admire your strength. Thank you for giving me a second chance. William noticed. You're too kind, he told her one day. No, Julia replied. I'm just done carrying the pain he gave me. But then, a twist, one that no one saw coming. A journalist reached out to Julia one afternoon. They were doing a feature on women in business and wanted to interview her. Excited, she agreed. But the next day, a different article surfaced. A headline that burned through every newspaper stand in town. Mail-order bride turned millionaire VP dumped at airport by this man. And under it, a photo of John. And worse, details only someone close to Julia could have known. Julia froze. She hadn't told the journalist about the airport incident. Only William and John knew. She turned pale. No, she whispered. Betrayal had come again. But from who? Julia's hands trembled as she clutched the newspaper. Her face felt hot, her chest heavy. The words on the page blurred as rage and disbelief surged through her. Who leaked this story? She hadn't spoken to the journalist about her past, not in detail, just general facts about her work, her marriage, and her journey. But somehow, the most painful part of her life, the humiliation at the airport, had made headlines. And the public loved it. The article went viral. People flooded the comment sections. She's an inspiration. That man's a fool. Look at her now. This story gave me hope. Julia's name was trending, but the wound reopened. Betrayal had come knocking. Again. That night, Julia confronted William first. "Did you talk to the reporter?" she asked calmly, searching his eyes. He looked hurt. "Of course not. I would never do that to you." She believed him. William had never given her a reason to doubt him. Not once. That left one person. John. The man she had forgiven. The man she had given a second chance. Julia sat in her office for hours, staring at his resume, her mind churning. The next morning, she summoned him. John entered slowly, clearly nervous. "You saw the paper," he said, eyes low. "I did," she replied coldly, "and only 2 people knew the full story." John looked up. Guilt was written all over his face. "I didn't know it would go public," he said weakly. "I was approached by someone from the paper. They asked about your journey, how you overcame everything. I thought I was helping." Julia stood. "You thought you were helping by digging up the worst moment of my life and handing it to the media like it was entertainment. I thought it would show how far you've come. You used my pain to clear your conscience." John dropped to his knees. "Please, I didn't mean to hurt you again. I swear." Tears welled in Julia's eyes, not from sadness, but from clarity. "You were never sorry. You were just desperate." "I've changed." "No, John, you've adapted. That's not the same as changing." She took a deep breath. "This time, I'm not crying at a train station. I'm not sitting on a bench with no direction. I'm not a broken woman anymore. I'm a wife, a leader, a woman who rebuilt her life from the ashes you left me in." John wept silently. Julia walked to the door and opened it. "You're fired. Kindly leave the premises and my life." He hesitated, then nodded. As he walked away, Julia felt no hate, no anger, just freedom. That night, she sat beside William on their rooftop garden, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars. He held her hand. "You okay?" "I am," she said softly. "For the first time, I really am." They sipped tea under the moonlight, the world around them quiet. The storm was over, but the blessings were just beginning. Julia continued to rise in her role. She expanded the hotel brand, launched a mentorship program for immigrant women, and opened her own foundation to support women struggling with self-worth and rejection. She gave speeches. She wrote a book titled The Bench by the Train Station, telling her story with dignity, power, and grace. It became a national bestseller. At the launch, she stood tall on stage, radiant in a royal blue gown. As cameras flashed and applause rang, she smiled and said into the microphone, "I was once left behind because of how I looked, but I found someone who saw me for who I was. And more importantly, I learned to see myself." The crowd stood. Tears flowed. And in the front row, William smiled proudly, clapping the loudest. Years later, people still told Julia that her story gave them hope. But for Julia, it was never about revenge. It was about redemption. She wasn't just the girl with the pretty face anymore. She was the woman who took heartbreak and built an empire. And she lived happily ever after, not because everything was perfect, but because she had finally learned her worth. And this time, she never let it go. Before you watch the next video, kindly subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed yet. Please click on the subscribe button and like this video. Be a part of my channel's growth by clicking on the next video on the screen and drop a comment to let me know what you think about the story. Thank you for watching. Much appreciation.